Hello everyone, my name's Dan and welcome to our tutorial for how to add a drop shadow in Photoshop as part of our graphic design tutorial series. We'll be creating a lot of free content for you, so make sure you click subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of when we upload. There are loads of ways to add a drop shadow in Photoshop, but firstly, I'll show you the most basic and easy way using the built-in tool. First, we need to create a Photoshop document. Open Photoshop, drop down the File menu, and select New. A window pops up prompting you to name your new document and enter dimensions and preferences. I'm happy with these default settings, so I'll click Create. Now I'll drag and drop a graphic into my image. I position it to where I want and hit Enter to place the subject. With the graphic selected in the Layers tab, I can head over to the bottom right-hand side of the screen, click on the small FX button, which might be a square on your version, and select Drop Shadow from the pop-up menu. A window will pop up and give you various options that you can adjust to your liking. In the Structure section, various sliders adjust different attributes of your drop shadow. Before we explore these options, I'll just adjust the distance so that the shadow becomes visible. As you can see, at the moment, with the distance set to 0, the shadow follows the same shape as your graphic. So I'll just move the slider over to the point where you can easily see your shadow. If I drag in a transparent object with a more complicated shape and add a drop shadow, only the opaque part of the image will cast the shadow. We'll take a look at adjusting this one. Incidentally, if you're using Photoshop with smart objects, don't worry if you press OK without finishing your changes. Go back to your layers and double-click on where it says Drop Shadow, and you'll get your drop shadow's layer style window back. I'm going to add a background texture to the composition so we can see the effect of the shadow. So, going back to adjusting the attributes of the shadow itself, the first slider within the Structure section is called Opacity. It can adjust how solid your shadow appears against the background. If we change the opacity of the shadow all the way to 100%, it'll basically appear like a solid object that's completely opaque. But you can experiment with this yourselves to your liking. The next things to look at are the angle and distance. We already adjusted this distance enough so that we could see the shadow, but now we can fine-tune that distance as well as rotating the shadow. Rather than a slider control, the angle adjustment is achieved by moving what looks to be a hand around a clock face. Adjusting angle and distance has the effect of moving the light source casting the shadow from different heights and angles. Rather than using the clock face and slider controls, you can enter numerical values in the data fields by the controls, or even use the arrow tool to grab and drag the shadow around your image while the layer style pop-up is still open. You may have noticed that near the top is a checkbox that says Use Global Light. This means that you can have multiple items with exactly the same settings, and then change them all at the same time as well. It's particularly useful if you have a large composition with multiple items that you may wish to adjust in the future, so you can match all of their exact shadow values. The next option to keep in mind is the Spread, and this adjusts the feathering or blurring of the edges. When we move it to 0, it's feathered very well, but moving it to 100%, the shadow is very sharp and solid. The next one is Size. This simulates diffusion of light affecting the object or the size of the light source in question, making the shadow appear softer. If you're a beginner, the best way to get the desired effect is simply through trial and error, so spend some time playing around with the sliders. Below the Structure section, you have the Quality section, where you can change the contour and add noise. Contouring is usually less for traditional shadows, but more for a stylistic enhancement to things like text. So that's the most basic way of manipulating drop shadows. But whilst the built-in tool was brilliant for basic use, graphic designers would prefer to create manual shadows that are manipulated perfectly. So another way to add a drop shadow is via the duplication method. Rather than relying on Photoshop's own drop shadow tool, this method creates an additional layer that duplicates your original graphic and uses that as the basis for your shadow, allowing a greater scope for editing and manipulation. We'll start off with some basic text by pressing the Text Layer button, clicking on the comp and typing out what we'd like. To make it easier to distinguish, I'll make this layer red and press the Enter key on the right-hand side of the keyboard to commit changes. Next, I'll click on the layer and Alt-drag it below, or Option-drag if you're on a Mac. Or alternatively, Ctrl or Command-J. I'll then change the text for the duplicated layer to black, and you'll see that when we hide the top layer using the eye icon, the layer behind is revealed. If you're creating a duplicate of a colored graphic to serve as its own shadow, you'll need to make the duplicate flat black before you start manipulating it to resemble a shadow. You can do this by right-clicking on the duplicate layer in Layers, selecting Blending Options, and then check the Color Overlay tick box and select black as the overlay color. We'll rename the bottom layer our Shadow layer so it doesn't get confusing. With our Shadow layer selected, we'll press Ctrl or Command-T to enable Free Transform. That brings up the blue control box around the layer that allows you to move it using the directional keys. As you can see, it moves pretty slowly, so you can also hold the Shift button to make the movements larger. Now we're in a position to manipulate the shadow however we want, so find a suitable place and anchor the object by pressing the Enter button. It looks quite good the way it is now, but further editing may be required for the shadow to appear authentic in context. By going to the Filter menu at the top, we'll go to Blur and Gaussian Blur, and this little window will pop up. This type layer must be rasterized or converted to a smart object before proceeding. If rasterized, its text will no longer be available to edit. It's always best to convert to a smart object, and I'll explain why in another video, but right now we're going to focus on blurring the layer. So as you can see, the background layer has less harsh edges now, and we can adjust this to as sharp or as soft as we want by adjusting the radius slider in the Gaussian Blur pop-up. But going too far makes the shadow look distorted or too generalized, so it's usually best to keep the radius at a sensible level. We'll press OK to add this change filter, which has appeared on the layer, and you can always double-click to go back to the option. Had we rasterized the layer, we wouldn't be able to add a smart filter, it would just commit a layer filter forever. Another handy advantage of having the shadow as a smart layer is that we can continue to tweak the perspective. By enabling the layer controls for the shadow layer like we did earlier, by selecting it in Layers and pressing Ctrl or Command-T, we can hold those keys while we warp whichever corner we want. Smart filters will be turned off temporarily, so don't worry if our lovely blur disappears while we adjust the perspective. It actually helps us out at this point as we can be more accurate with the placement of the shadow's base. I want to make it look like the shadow is coming directly off the text, so I stretch it out a little bit further than the height of the text. Press Enter like we did earlier, and then disable the blur using the eye icon. It still doesn't look right, and that's because we moved the shadow layer earlier when it was a 2D style shadow. We can now move it back manually using the directional keys. And finally, we'll change the opacity of the shadow layer so it's no longer completely opaque. And now it looks great. And there you have it. 2 easy ways to create shadows in Photoshop. If you found this video useful, please leave a like, and if you've got any questions or suggestions, please feel free to comment them. We're creating all kinds of tutorials for Adobe programs, so hit subscribe and enjoy our content. My name's Dan from Solarpress. Thank you for watching.